Thank you so much. I'm Ann. This is Holly. You look like a friendly group, so you'll forgive us if we're shuffling books and turning pages and we get confused sometimes. What we intend to do is read a little bit from the preface, then read a little more from the introduction, and then read about 3 minutes each from about 9 of the stories that our participants have given us. Holly and I have only actually written in our own voices the preface, the introduction, and the acknowledgements. Everything in between are the voices of other people. You want to talk about how that happened?
Sure. Would you like me to do that now?
Yeah, do that now.
Sure, I'll do that right now. You'll find out in a little bit how we decided to write this book. Then we had to choose the people that we were going to interview, and some of those people suggested other people that would be good to interview. We arranged for places to meet and do the interviews. We taped the interviews and then went home and we transcribed them. And then we gave the transcriptions to the people that we interviewed, and they could make any corrections or cross things out and say, oh, we don't want you to include that. And then we sent them the revised and shortened piece that we were going to submit for them, and then we even had to shorten it one more time. So the people were kind of really involved in this. And the last thing I want to say about this is that we intend to give the full transcriptions to the Everglades archives so that it can be used for research in future.
Okay, from the preface.
Yeah. During the years when we were working on our first book, Paddling the Everglades Wilderness Waterway, we met some adventurous people out there who told fascinating stories. This is where it all started. One evening, soon after that book had been accepted for publication, we sat on an overturned bucket at Alligator Point, listening to Bill Leonard in his 70s talking about coming down from Maine year after year to paddle the waterway.
When we went back inside our tent, we looked at each other, each with the same thought. We've got another book to write. A few months later, Holly interviewed Bill at his home in Maine.
In California, Anne interviewed William Truesdell, whose guidebook to the Everglades Wilderness Waterway had been our constant companion while we were writing a guidebook of our own.
The process of writing this book was begun. It was a long process. From that moment at Alligator Point when we were sitting on buckets and going in our tent until the time we held a book in our hands was 10 years. It was extremely time consuming to do all the transcription, and then we couldn't just pull a chunk out. We had to move things around. We really had to craft the story out of a mass of material. So we are thrilled to be here holding these books today. Okay. Before we begin reading from the introduction, just a word about how wonderful our mangroves are, and I hope you already know this. There are over 230,000 acres of mangrove in Everglades National Park alone, and of course there are other mangroves up the coast. These are the largest stand of continuous mangroves in the world. And what neither of us knew when we first became engaged with the mangroves was that mangroves are the best carbon sink on the planet. Acre for acre, mangroves sequester more carbon than a rainforest or any other kind of upland forest. And I think we're not hearing enough about that. It's also true that because they store so much carbon, if we destroy the mangroves, they release all that carbon. We got to take care of them. Okay.
Okay, this mangrove scape is dynamic, constantly changing with the forces of tide and wind.
Shifting depositions of sand and mud.
The slow, continuous fall of senescent leaves.
The rich accumulation of detritus that transforms repeatedly through food webs.
Becomes the source of life in its branches.
Its roots.
Its waters.
And the air above the mangle.
Fin.
Wing.
Carapace.
Jelly.
Islands are born and islands disappear, or simply change their size and shape.
Hurricanes sometimes divide an island, splitting it in two.
Nothing is static out there.
Most of what can be called land out there, beyond the mainland's mangrove fringe, was created by the early people of the Glades, people who constructed shell mounds, not simply middens, not accumulations of randomly cast off materials, but systematically engineered communities of mounds.
Archaeologists like Margot Schwarden are now discovering these mounds to be far more complex than has previously been understood. These two are ringed by mangroves.
There are no roads out there. To get out there, one must take a fish route or a bird route.
Go by boat, kayak, canoe, or motorboat, or fly in a plane or helicopter.
Apart from designated campsites on a few scattered shell mounds, if you want to pitch a tent, you'll need to follow riverine mangroves or chains of mangrove islands to the Gulf beaches.
Might be a good time to change the slide. Or to remain on the interior, reserve a chickie, a wooden platform constructed over water with open sides and a slanted roof.
And there's a chickie. So that's where you sleep if you want to go out there at night, deep into the mangroves. The voices in this book tell stories of going out there. Some speak from early days in Everglades National Park. Bill Truesdell remembers mapping and marking the Everglades Wilderness Waterway, then writing the first guidebook for that 99-mile water trail.
Ralph Mealy, first ranger pilot in the National Park Service, tells stories of flying with politicians and scientists over remote mangrove wilderness areas when the park was still being shaped and biological studies just beginning.
Wanda Brown Townsend remembers a time before there was a national park when her aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents lived on Fakahatchee Island, just beyond what is now the park boundary.
Sonny Bass and Leon Howell also remember growing up at a mangrove fringe before there was a national park, and then ultimately coming to work in the park.
No one goes out there without specifically wanting to. This is a book about people who want to.
Some go for work, some for adventure, some for philosophy, some for science.
But the people represented in this book defy categorization.
Tony Terry, the law enforcement ranger who patrols the mangroves as part of his job, goes back out on his days off to release the tensions of the job, to fish, to find peace.
Lichen researchers, Rick and Jean Seavey, go out for field work, but they speak of the context in which they work as spiritual.
Supervisory park ranger Susan Reese loves to put her hands in the mangrove muck.
Roger Hammer, the expert in plants of the Everglades, goes out there not so much to look at plants, all of which he calls intimately by their scientific and common names, but because he loves to catch and cook a fat redfish, have a fine meal with a glass of Merlot in deep wilderness, and because he loves solitude.
Many of these voices speak of solitude. Anne Rugel, solo paddler, speaks of glorious solitude and being blissfully stranded.
Tom Buttle echoes that. Getting stranded here isn't a bad thing.
Rick Horton, calling these strings of islands a kayaker's rosary, says that for him, time spent alone in the wilderness is a time of spiritual redemption.
Some speak of companionship. Sometimes it's the companionship of a life partner, sometimes a fishing buddy or a group of friends.
Bill Leonard talks about heading out with groups of 12 or more people to paddle the Everglades Wilderness Waterway.
Eco-adventure guide John Lewis attends to the varying interests and experience levels of small groups who explore the mangroves close to Chokoloskee Island.
Many miles deeper in the mangroves, John and Donna Buckley greet paddlers and entertain guests on their houseboat, the Swamp Lily.
Some go to fish.
Some never fish.
John Bob Carlos used to go for the fish, but little by little began leaving the fishing rod at home, taking the camera.
Leon Howell fishes, but has long since quit caring whether I caught fish or not.
Many speak of being tested, of meeting challenges, of tide, wind, weather, equipment failure, getting lost, sheltering from storms, or recovery from one's own errors.
Most say that no matter how many times you go, no matter how long you stay, there's always an element of surprise, something unexpected.
Every time there is something new, says photographer Constance Meyer.
The one thing these storytellers have in common is that they didn't go just once.
Their stories are replete with accounts of stranding,
Being lost,
being besieged by insects,
struggling in the elements.
suffering discomforts.
But as Tony Nippers reminded us, attitude is the difference between an adventure or an ordeal, and he actually has that painted on his boat.
In spite of, or maybe even because of, the challenges, these voices speak passionately about being out there and going back.
We keep going back too, and we have sometimes asked ourselves, why?
We've been out there for days, muscles aching,
A cold front moving in,
no-see-ums appearing in swarms,
storms moving across South Florida,
and lightning flashing all around us.
or sleeping in the canoe because wind has blown the water out of our shallow bay.
And we ask, now, why is it we keep wanting to come back out here?
The answer to that question may be floating in our genetic ancestry.
Some remnant of profound connection with the wild that lingers, and in spite of challenges and discomforts, makes wilderness feel,
As Vivian Oliva says, like home.
there is something profound about being out there. And no matter what discomforts we may experience in any given trip,
No matter how glad we may be to have that first shower when we get back,
within weeks, we are talking about when we might head out there again,
because out there we are somehow stabilized.
somehow reconnected with the very origins of life on Earth, its rhythms and cycles of life and death, moving tides and changing skies.
A dolphin swims up to the Chickee where we were sitting at the end of the day, stops, lifts his head out of the water, looks at us, and we know that somehow we are connected.
Everything, all of us, are connected.
For a number of years, wildlife biologist Skip Snow's assignment in Everglades National Park was to learn as much as possible about pythons that have taken up residence there. He says, I have thought about writing a book in which you would learn stuff about pythons in the park. But it wouldn't be like a chapter on how they reproduce and then a chapter on what they eat. It would be a book about places, kind of like Dr. Seuss in that book, All the Places You Go, right? The places that pythons led me, the different roads I went down, like a travelogue through the python encounters. But you would come out of my book knowing something about pythons.
We feel we have written a similar book about mangroves. There are no specific chapters on how they grow, how they reproduce, or the ecological role they play. Rather, there are stories of mangrove places, voices of people who go there for a wide variety of reasons.
We believe that through these voices, through stories of adventure, investigation, and inspiration, we learn something about our Everglades mangrove wilderness.
Okay, what you're looking at there is the Swamp Lily 2, which was the winter home of Don and Jonna Buckley for over 30 years. They worked as volunteers in Everglades National Park. They lived way out in the mangroves. They did search and rescue. They assisted with research. They greeted paddlers who were going by and went looking for people who got lost. They're some of my favorite people in the world, actually. We've become really good friends. So a little piece from John and Donna Buckley. I'll be John and she'll be Donna. We overheard a call on the radio. A guy had spotted 4 whales on the beach. So we jump in this powerboat and head down there. Coming into Highland Beach, we could see big black objects up on the sand. We stopped maybe 100 yards off the beach. I hopped out and got into my Monarch, my canoe kayak thing.
My role was to stay on the park radio, stay in contact with dispatch. I had just had hip replacement surgery, so I wasn't about to jump in and try to wrestle whales.
She was monitoring the whales that were still offshore, a compact group of maybe 30 or 40 whales.
They weren't moving. They were just kind of hanging out.
Up on the beach, I found more than 4 whales, most of them partway in the water. I picked out the liveliest looking one, got in the water and got a hold of him by the tail. It felt fantastic, like a high quality rubber mat, wet but firm to grab. There's enough cartilage, I guess, in the tail and no slime like on a fish. When whales flap, they flap up and down rather than side to side like a fish. So my arms were going up and down, and I was wiggling him this way and wiggling him that way, rocking him and pulling him in the water, and everything was working out well. But when you have them on their side, they're no longer going up and down. Next time he wanted to flap, boom, he just launched my ass right out into the water. That was exciting.
And I'm standing there going, oh, John.
Once I realized that that was the way it was, it didn't happen anymore. I got a couple of them in the water, and then some help from Everglades City showed up. We got some whales off the shore, but some would make a little loop and head back in. We'd go out and meet them, redirect them, and start them off again. But they didn't have any great enthusiasm for getting back into the Gulf, and the pod didn't have any enthusiasm for leaving. After we got 5 off and left 4 that were obviously dead or would be dead soon, we had to get back home. But Donna had gotten information out over the radio about the pod and the beached whales. The next day we got a call saying there would be NOAA veterinarians coming, and we were to meet them halfway. I'd say we met 11 boats there, park rangers, Fish and Wildlife folks, NOAA, and the Coast Guard.
And pretty soon there were helicopters, TV channels, it was a zoo.
That day we got in boats behind the pod and spent hours gently herding them out to sea. I paddled right on the edge of the pod with the whale I figured was the leader. We were eye to eye for hours.
The next one we're going to talk about is Constance Meyer, a photographer. She was a professor of exercise physiology at Barry University, and I went down there and interviewed her right in the middle of all her exercise equipment. Well, she's retired now, and she's a photographer and travels the country in her RV.
And this is her gorgeous photo.
June 2009, I got a call from one of the guys that helps the park clear out the Bear Lake Canoe Trail. He says, you gotta go with me to Mud Lake because I just saw 30 flamingos back there. He said, I saw all this orange and I thought it was a bunch of kayaks. I get close and there were 30 flamingos just hanging out. You've got to go in there and photograph them. So I met him at the marina at 5:30 in the morning, and we drove down that pothole-infested dirt road to the launch site on the Buttonwood Canal. We headed out the canal and through Coot Bay and the creek into Mud Lake. Mud Lake's huge. Bob says, okay, well, that's where I saw them the other day. The birds were not there. The space was empty, pink color. I'm looking and thinking, there's terrible light over there. We keep paddling. I'm thinking, God, this lake is huge. We're never going to see these flamingos. They're gone. I paddle, and we go around a point, and I look to the right, and just when my heart begins to sink, I spot a large pinkish aberration several hundred yards away, standing out against the greens and browns of the mangrove shoreline. There were 16 or 17 of them, and they were in perfect light. I paddled to within 100 feet, staked out my boat, and sat for 3 hours photographing flamingos. It was mesmerizing to watch them feeding in the grass and mud. The sun blazed hot, but I never felt an ounce of discomfort. I had never seen flamingos in the wild and never realized how large they are. The largest of the group stood over 5 feet tall. They were busy feeding. I watched one bird move his legs back and forth quickly in the water, similar to what a snowy egret might do when foraging. It appeared that at any given time, half of the group would have heads submerged while the other half would be looking about. Once something got the group's attention and they simultaneously stood upright and faced the same direction. The Pauline Reeves Gallery in the Everglades Museum had my exhibit in November. One of my flamingo shots was there, and people in the reception would look at the photograph and go, "Where did you photograph these, in Miami?" Everybody thinks they're at the zoo, so I tell them I had to paddle 5 miles on a June morning to get them.
And this is Roger Hammer. Some of you probably have his books on Everglades wildflowers or paddling in the Everglades. He has 6 or 8 books now, and it's a pretty famous guy, but very down to earth. I'm going to read a little bit from his story here. One of the classes I teach is for the volunteers at Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden on the human and natural history of South Florida. I ask, how many people here have been to Everglades National Park? And every single time, only about half of them raise their hand. So I talk about some of my adventures out there, and the first question out of their mouth is, aren't you scared? We get that question too. And I'm going, you know, it's scarier driving in Miami. I'm sure you've heard of people getting killed in car wrecks. Now, how many people have you heard of getting killed canoeing in the Everglades? So I don't know. People just don't understand. You know, every time you go out, you see something different. The last time I paddled out there, I was leaving Highland Beach across that big expanse of the Broad River, and I paddled upon the mother of all tiger sharks. She was just cruising there. I paddled right up next to it, and I could see a cadre of remoras attached to its sides. It was probably around 14 feet long, a good reminder of why you shouldn't go swimming in that area. You can go out there as many times as you want in a year, and every single time you go, you'll see something that you haven't seen before. I've had crocodiles crawl up out of the Gulf onto the beach at East Cape and dig nests while I'm sleeping at night. You'll hear them digging, thinking they're sea turtles. Then you get up and go, wait a minute, that's not a sea turtle. I keep going back. Part of it is wilderness. There's not much of that left in South Florida, especially in Miami. And that's another thing that I try to point out to people who live in Miami. Here you have this mega city with 2 million people, and you can be out sitting on the pristine beach of Cape Sable and oftentimes be the only person out there. 12 miles of glorious beach, all to myself. And then at night you can look to the east and see the glow of the lights of Miami. That's certainly part of it for me, the solitude. A lot of people don't like solitude, which makes it good for those of us who do.
This is Rick Horton's kayak and tent on Hog Key. And we first met Rick Horton when we were out there at the Harney River Chickie. And later on I interviewed him at the house he built on the porch of that house on the Caloosahatchee River in LaBelle. This is Rick. We think of him as sort of a philosopher. My memory of things that do not interest me is quite poor. Unfortunately, much of what I have been doing in my life seems to fall into that category. But my memory of things that took place on or in the water is very good. Several meetings with dolphins when they come up and gaze at me with that unblinking jet black eye as if to say, I am curious. What are you? Will you play with me? The time Pauline and I saw 2 dolphins, one sighted and the other blind, its eyes white and completely opaque, with the sighted one gently guiding the blind one by nudging its snout under the other's chin. The roseate spoonbills I drifted under while riding on the incoming tide into the pass at Rogers River. The immature laughing gull I paddled up to and brought into the boat to remove fishing line and hook from its wing, which then sat on my kayak and regarded me with his jet bead eye as if to try and understand what had just taken place. The laughing gull that held my eye on the Bay of Ponce de Leon, wondering why I would be out there in such adverse conditions. The star fields at night, and me wondering at my proper place in all of this immensity. Also memorable, but for different reasons, the osprey hanging dead in one black mangrove with a shiny fishing lure through its taloned foot and the line wrapped in the branches, its mate sitting on another branch calling. How many days did it take for the first bird to die, trying to fly and not being able, finally hanging upside down? The hawksbill turtle found dead on the beach with the marks of an improperly functioning turtle excluder crushed into its carapace. How long did that creature that can hold its breath for hours last in the throat of the net with tons of catch piling on? But the trip that has left me the most indelible memories was a trip that I chose to take with no books, no MP3 player, phone, or electronic device. I even chose not to keep a trip journal. I wanted to spend 10 days by myself, just listening in the wilderness. I wanted to really try to see the interconnection between the natural elements and this wonderfully harsh environment that calls me so deeply. Even now, if I close my eyes and calm my mind, I can recall almost every paddle stroke with amazing clarity.
Wanda Brown Townsend, sitting in the front there in the red shirt, is in her 80s, was in her 80s when she was in that boat. The person behind her is Rick Horton, about whom she just read. Rick is her neighbor, all right? And we're taking a trip to Fakahatchee Island here.
At the age of 80, Wanda Brown Townsend took a kayak trip from Everglades City to Fakahatchee Island, where her grandparents and other family members had lived when she was a child. This was her first trip to Fakahatchee in approximately 50 years. Her neighbor, Rick Horton, facilitated the trip and provided paddle power for her kayak. The authors, Holly and Ann, made this paddle alongside Rick and Wanda. Wanda was equipped with a digital recorder and a clip-on microphone.
Well, now, I didn't live out there. It was my people. I just went down and visited. We would go to my grandpa and grandmother's place, stay 2 or 3 days, then go over and stay with my cousins, with Uncle Finn's and Aunt Ada. I'd stay down there a week at a time, you know. It was great. You want me to get in this kayak?
Yes, ma'am. Put your hand on my shoulder.
I told Virginia, I said, don't look for me at prayer meeting tonight. I won't be there. She said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to Fakahatchee kayaking. She said, kayaking? They just can't believe I would even kayak. Not even my brother. I'm going to call him when I get back. I've got it made. I don't even have to paddle. I turned over in one of these things once.
You're not going to turn over today.
You know, Uncle Finn's and Aunt Ada always seemed elderly to me. But you couldn't tell it in their actions. They didn't have too much of an education, but they knew how to work and get by, let me tell you. They had cows. We would make our own butter. Aunt Ada had a big churn for hers, but she'd give us girls a quart jar, and we'd sit in a chair and shake those quart jars, make our butter. Grandpa, he made a long table and a bench in behind it for us children. We'd sit there, and we couldn't wait for grandmother to milk a cow, bring the milk in, and we'd drink it warm. They always cooked on a wooden stove. That's why we called it a wooden stove. They had good food back there. Curlews would fly over, and we would kill a mess of them and bring them in, cook them up right then. And young cranes, you could go out at night when they come in to roost, kill them with just a stick, bring them in to cook them up. They was really good, more tender than the curlews. I mean, the white curlews, you know, the old ones. They were so tough you have to stew them and put gravy on them. If you get the brown ones, you can fry them, but they're still tough to me. It's been a long time since I've eaten anything like that. Can't do it anymore. All the bread was homemade. We used to call them Johnny Hookers, cooked on the iron griddle. You have to cook them so slow, make sure the middle is done, because they're thick. Uncle Flynn and Aunt Ada's daughter could really cook them. She'd cook a big old pot of lima beans, Aunt Ada had about 11 children. My grandmother had 11. Whoop.
I got her. You have a picture? Oh. Can you see that there? That's Vivian Oliva. And I told you about Connie Meyer, who was a photographer. She took this picture of Vivian out in the Everglades. She's a fisherwoman, Vivian is. And she loves to fish, but she also likes to do a lot of stuff with her, I don't know what you'd call it, but the device on your phone that can plot areas in the Everglades through little channels that aren't marked. I'm going to share two things from Olivia, from Vivian. First of all, it's a piece of her blog, and then the second thing is going to be just some little thoughts she had in her interview. Got a little light here. Darwin's Place is one of my favorite places in the Everglades. It's full of snook and beautiful birds. There have been times when the alligator population is large, but I've not had a problem fishing around them. Today would be a different story. At camp, I switched to my St. Croix travel rod that I keep in a rod case for days off from paddling. I set up my cooler near my seat back, pliers, tackle dry bag, lip gaff, and was on my way. Clearing the first creek, I came across my usual snook spot and cast. Boom! A nice hit from a pretty large snook that came up shaking its head from side to side. He headed towards one of the many deadfalls in the creek, and I was afraid I couldn't stop it. Meanwhile, from the corner of my eye, I spotted a very large alligator right next to my canoe, very interested in the hooked snook. Now, I'm not usually afraid of alligators, but this one was intent on my fish, and the creek was not big enough for all of us to respect our distance. At this point, I'd lost control of the snook, and I let it wrap up and break off in the snag. I moved on to the next bend. The second bend in the creek was the spot where I had some action in the past. Stopping to tie on a new lure, I discovered that I brought my clothes bag instead of my fishing bag. Ugh. Luckily, I keep a small tackle box behind my seat. I tied on a space guppy, shad tail, and started casting, working the deadfall and snags around the bend. I got another hit, and see that numerous gator heads are now coming up to the surface. Never have I been surrounded by so many alligators in here. At this point, I'm hesitant to fish in this creek. Too bad, because there are fish here. But I continue to the large lake, and the winds start up with sporadic rain. Working the shorelines, I get no takers. Those dang fish are all in that alligator-infested creek. What to do? I muster enough courage to go back to the fish and try to ignore the alligators, but with every cast, they're getting more interested. I decide to give up fishing and just enjoy the creek for the beautiful place that it is. The alligators win. And her thoughts, the silence. I think I must have asked her, what is your favorite part of being out there? The silence. The silence. To be away from the noise and be in the wilderness, traveling with the rhythm out of the alligators, the Everglades by working the tides, traveling slow enough to really experience the subtle beauty of this wilderness that has become a passion for me. With the powerboat, I sped along, covering miles, but never really seeing or hearing anything. I want to slow life down, really enjoy it. I also want to get there under my own power. As I get older, this is becoming more important to me. I am still learning, experimenting with new routes, new techniques, and different paddlecraft. Great ways to fully enjoy this gift we share in Florida, the magnificent Everglades. I feel like the Everglades are my home.
This photograph is by John Bob Carlos, who is a serious Everglades and Big Cypress photographer. He does wonderful work and often exhibits throughout South Florida. If you ever get a chance to see his work, I recommend it. John Bob Carlos. My grandmother, before she passed, she said, "You've been going back there into those areas a lot." I said, "Yes." She said, "It's in your blood." I said, what do you mean? She said, some of your family was from Florida and they left to Cuba. It's full circle now. You're returning back to where you have ancestry. The Indians that were in Cuba used to travel back and forth, and some of the indigenous folks there in Cuba are mixed into our family. I've always felt this affinity for the Everglades. I feel like on some of those islands where the shell works were done, there's people out there, still, watching. There were stories and songs, and I can almost hear them. Some of the islands back in the Everglades National Park have mounds, and there are certain areas you feel they're sacred. I've run into artifacts, blades and things from indigenous folks. I try not to touch them, because in my culture, it's bad to touch or move anything from the past. When I was 16, 17, I was fishing and camping, finding every little nook and pond that I could hop into and explore. I didn't have a map, and I didn't know anyone that had ever been out there. I started exploring deeper in those mangroves. I'd go in the morning with that light coming in and the birds. I'd be out there seeing everything wake up, and that was serenity. In my culture, my Cuban heritage, we believe that when you go through the mangroves or go through any forest, it's a cleaning. There's thousands and thousands of leaves, and each plant takes away a bad thing from you. You have clean air, and you have those trees, and you have the water, and each thing takes something bad away. It almost became an obsession for me to go out there, and at the time I was fishing, always following the fish, trying to figure out where does this fish go and how does it live. Paddling was the best way to get into the mangroves and into good fishing spots. I was trying to do all the trails I could, trying to get to the most remote areas, and fishing was heaven out there. Then I started finding that fishing was not so important. Getting out there was what mattered, and I realized I had fallen in love. Fishing was okay, but seeing those dolphins play and move around in that water became more important to me. Or seeing those sea turtles, or sawfish in the water. I was finding beautiful orchids and plants, and I started learning about them, like when to go to see the cocoa orchid in bloom. Little by little, my rod started staying home. I kept taking the camera. Ooh, there we go.
Okay, Ann Rugel is a volunteer in Everglades National Park, and I interviewed her at the shelter at West Lake getting close to Flamingo, and she likes to sail and camp in her folding boat out in the Everglades. Everglades National Park is a designated wilderness area, but it's a wilderness area that permits motorboats. So for a while, I was timid about anchoring out, afraid of getting hit by a powerboat while I was sleeping at anchor. Permit problems finally forced the issue. I was supposed to stay at New Turkey Key one night. I had the permit, but I found it already occupied. There were families with little children playing in the sand, and I didn't have the heart to say, look, you have to leave because I have the permit for the night. I just turned Hazel around and decided, okay, this is the night. I'll try out my shelter and sleep on my boat. The only place I could find on my chart that looked at all welcoming was Bird Key, a little lagoon-shaped island where I'd be sheltered and hidden. It looked snug and safe. Oysters are my biggest fear. I tremble in terror at the thought of Hypalon slashing oyster beds. Her folding boat is made of Hypalon, which is like a rubbery material, and snags. When you're sailing and the wind is shoving you right towards something scary and sharp, you can't just put on the brakes and back paddle. The chart clearly showed that the lagoon inside the key would be high and dry at low tide, but there was plenty of water there right then, so I went in. I needed the security of being enclosed inside the mangrove walls. It should be a nice, soft, oozy bottom, right? When the tide went down, I would settle on nice, squishy mud, right? So I tied up between a couple of mangrove trees near the shore and set up my netting shelter well before mosquito time. This is, by the way, from inside her netting shelter on her boat at mosquito time. As the tide began to go down, I noticed with a jolt that not only was water under the boat dropping fast, jagged things were starting to poke up out of the bay. Snags, waterlogged branches with clumps of live oysters on them, and dead oyster shells that just look around to get you. They were all over the place. Oh man, there could be some right under my boat. At this point, my boat was still swinging a little bit. It hadn't actually picked the spot it was going to settle on. So I leaned over the side with my trusty and indestructible full boat paddle and felt under the boat to try to scope out the situation, and there were definitely things there, hard, jagged things. I leaned over one side and started sweeping clumps out from under the boat with the paddle, throwing them far away. Then I leaned over the other side to do the same thing, and the boat shifted. Now I had to clear an even wider spot. This was not working. Finally, I hopped out, sank into 6 inches of mud, and continued the sweeping process, trying to get her settled in a safe spot. Before I was finished, she settled. At this point, I only knew for sure that the aft half of the boat was safely on oyster-free muck. So for hours, I sat hunched up at the back of the cockpit, afraid to put my weight anywhere else. Finally, I realized what will be, will be. I'll wake up with an oyster shell sticking up through my hull, or I won't. I made dinner and went to bed.
Leon Howell has had 3 careers now. First in the Coast Guard, second as a charter boat captain, and now he's a seasonal ranger at Everglades National Park. He grew up in Homestead, and so from childhood was going out in those mangroves. I've never been much of a camper, but when I got back down here after the stint in the Coast Guard, I says, I got to get myself out on the wilderness waterway, got to get out there. I did 2 10-day trips with a buddy. He had a canoe, I had a canoe, 600 pounds of gear each. We were not freeze-dried backpackers. We had little motors that would allow us to cover 25 miles in a day if we wanted to. One year, we launched from Chokoloskee and came down to Camp Lonesome. We used chickees going and coming, but we'd set up on ground sites for 3 or 4 days and explore with canoes, fish, take pictures, always had cameras. I'd never done any serious backcountry camping like that, no radios, no nothing. And something I didn't expect happened. You know, I've heard talk about a wilderness experience. I'm not sure what a wilderness experience is, but when I was out there was a shift in my perception and in my emotions that was so subtle I didn't notice it until I returned. When I came back, both times this happened. First time I thought, no, it's an anomaly, but it happened a second time. You get back to the boat ramp, and there's the car, and there's an airplane, and somebody's got a radio on. It's all incongruous. It's startling. You know, I thought I was out there. I didn't have a whole lot to do, but I wasn't bored. I got up early, went to sleep well, at least after the first couple of nights. I thought, well, damn, maybe that's a wilderness experience. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what that is you get out there, but it's an experience, a personal, internal experience that I would have never had in my life if I hadn't done something like that. I would have no clue about it. And now I have at least an idea of what, to me, is a wilderness experience. Something happened to me out there. I didn't know it was happening until I came back. Okay. So there you have samples of 9 of our stories. There's a whole lot more in the book. Thank you. Thank you. Do you have questions? Yes?
My question for you is, what was your experience with pythons, with all of your traveling out there? Were you intimately related to them? Did you know they were around?
My very first full day in Everglades National Park in 2003, I was reporting there for an artist residency. I would live in the park for a month. And my first day there was an all-day battle at Taylor Slough between a python and an alligator. The media came out, crowds gathered, it really went on all day long. So I was very quickly introduced to the python question, but I have never seen one since. It was on that day that it really came to the attention of the park that they probably had a serious problem. And at that point, they assigned wildlife biologist Skip Snow to work specifically in a focused way on, what's going on here and what can we do about it. People ask us a lot. They used to always ask, aren't you afraid of alligators? Now they ask, aren't you afraid of pythons? We're not afraid of either. Pythons are actually very secretive. They hide. Even the scientists have trouble locating them. They'll have, they have radio chips in some of them so they can track them and try to figure out what their behaviors are and find their nests. But even when they've got one chipped and they're out there and it's beep, beep, beeping, they know the python is around, they have trouble finding it sometimes. So pythons are not coming after people, They're wreaking havoc on small mammals in the park. It's a serious problem, but no, we're not afraid of them, and you don't need to be afraid of them either. Not personally afraid.
Okay, but I have something to say about that.
Okay, she has something to say about that.
On one of our paddles, and I don't remember which one, we ran into some people who were also canoeing, and they said that they had run into a python on the Chickee in the Privy.
Oh, I remember
And
that.
now, yeah, and I don't know if you noticed in that picture about the chickees, but each one has a little outhouse sitting on it. I mean, that would freak me out.
Well, it would freak me out too, but I didn't see it. I wasn't there.
Another thing, when we were trying to figure out which stories to read to you pieces of, I was kind of inclined to read something from Tony Terry, who is a ranger out in the park, and he had a very interesting rattlesnake story. So if you're interested in snakes, that's one.
That's the story for you. Yeah. That's the snake story. Yeah. But to follow up on Holly's, that python that was in the outhouse, it was a young one. I learned about this later because it was the Buckleys who were called to go out and get the python from the outhouse. So, yes? You.
What would your recommendations be for exploring the Everglades multiple-day trips for a single woman?
Multiple day trip for a single woman. You want to go first and I'll follow?
No, you go ahead.
Anne Rugel is the person to talk to. She goes out there for longer than a week alone, a lot. I've only been out alone once. I went out alone for 9 days.
I wouldn't particularly want to go alone, honestly.
Okay, I'm sorry, I misheard the question.
No,
I thought you said a woman.
I might have phrased it incorrectly. I think as far as a couple other people or clubs or guides or that sort of thing, going the first time by myself isn't really a great.
I get that. I'd been doing it 18 years before I went out by myself for 9 days. But you really should have our other book.
That's true.
That's the one that talks about, it's focused on that 100-mile trail, and how to do that. But there are also a lot of day trips, overnight trips, and how you can work the two ends of that trail, both north and south. There are terrific places you can go out for just a few nights and come back, either out of Everglades City or out of Flamingo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Connie Meyer, the photographer, decided she'd be brave and do a solo trip on her own, and she just went out to Picnic Key from Chokoloskee and came back. The only problem with something like that is you have to be aware of the tides. So you need to read and talk to people.
Yeah, don't head out there not having studied it, but I have a sense you wouldn't do that. You're being cautious with the question even. There's a lot to know. but it's very doable. Mhm. Mhm. Anything else you're curious about?
The conclusion of all of the stories.
Curious about the conclusion?
Yeah.
Well, I tell you, it was an awful lot of fun doing this book, getting to know these people. You know, they're fascinating people who've done really amazing things, and who have deep spirits. I think we may have been a little surprised at how so many of them felt that it was spiritual to be out there. I mean, even when we were interviewing scientists and expecting them to talk about the science, they did talk about the science. But sooner or later, they got around to that other thing, that deeper value of being there. It was really a privilege to be with them, to hear their stories, to work with their stories. It's been a great adventure. And now the book is done. Okay, should we call it done? And if any of you do want books, there's some at the back. We've pre-signed a bunch of them, but we can personalize them if you want it. Yes?
Yes.
Well, we're working on different things this time. I actually have another book coming out in January about a year that I spent in Nigeria. And you want to talk about the book you're working on?
And I paint and sketch, and I'm working on sketches of Florida wildflowers.
And then after that, I'm going to write another book about the Everglades. I've got several books I want to write about the Everglades. So. But they're very personal, so they're not the kind of thing that we would collaborate on. You know, I have yet to write a really personal book about the Everglades. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.